Well, a very good evening and welcome to First Call, a funeral podcast, episode 3. Bradley Shaw, thank you for joining me here in Havelock North. Nice to have you here once again.
Yeah, it's great to be back in the mighty Hawke's Bay, Terry, and what a lovely day we've put on again today for a little bit of podcasting.
Absolutely, to be expected in the Hawke's Bay. Of course, we are streaming out of the Terry Longley and Son funeral services right here in Havelock North.
That we are.
So why don't we crack into it? We're going to be talking about costs and pricing, how to save money when planning and organising a funeral, and a little bit of information for people out there that they may not know of.
Yeah, that's right, Terry. I guess people, broadly speaking, funerals do cost money, and there's an expectation that there will be cost to a family when we're talking about funerals. But I think we'd start with what the main costs to us are.
So to a funeral home. So
initially we'll touch on that, and then we'll move into the pricing sort of side of things.
The consumer costs.
That's right. So I guess we've got 3 main points in which are the main costs to us as a funeral provider, as a funeral home. So we'll start with the first one, and that's our biggest asset, our biggest cost, the face of our business and everything that we're about, and that's our staff.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like any business, which funeral homes are, there are thousands of costs which go into running a funeral home. Of course, we're going to talk about those top 3 costs, and as you mentioned, our staff is right up there with our biggest asset, but also our greatest expenditure. And we need to touch on this because this is where most of our core charges are going to go, to those highly trained, highly qualified staff. And we talked about it on previous episodes. You know, we talked about funeral directors working on an on-call roster. They're available 24/7.
That's right.
And most funeral homes around the country are going to have at least 2 funeral directors ready to respond at any time. They're taking your call at 3 a.m, heading up to the hospital. And some of that work can be quite demanding, quite stressful, and even traumatic in some cases.
That's right.
So
yeah.
Our staff are always well compensated.
That's right. And, unfortunately, for us as the provider, we can't just employ people on a minimum wage basis. We're employing, as you said, qualified people who are special people, like we've mentioned in the previous podcast, that are trained specifically to deal with people's grief and helping them through that journey.
Also, and we should also acknowledge the auxiliary staff. So we've talked about the funeral directors and embalmers, but also the administrators. We've got the graphic designers, the funeral assistants, all help support that funeral director to plan that funeral.
That's right. I think the second one that we should definitely touch on is the premises. The premises that we provide. Funeral homes, are most commonly a big premises, that can contain so many different elements, and they don't just run themselves, do they?
No, essentially not at all, they don't. And when you think about what a funeral home should include, we're talking about arrangement rooms. So this is a room you sit down with the funeral director to actually plan the funeral.
We're actually sitting in there now.
This is at one of ours here at Terry Longley and Son. But of course, you're going to have viewing rooms. This is where the deceased is placed while they're at the funeral home for family to visit, which is going to be a very different room to the one you sit down to plan the funeral. Of course, funeral homes can have multiple viewing rooms. We talked in the last episode about the mortuary and the refrigeration units, which do take up quite a large footprint within the building. Some funeral homes even have chapels in their funeral home. We've got a chapel here for 35, but we've also got another chapel in Hastings called Crestwood, which holds 200.
Yeah, that's right.
And so we've got to factor all these kind of things into account.
Definitely. And I mean, for us at Gateway Funeral Services in Whakatane, we have our own chapel on site catering to 150. So, that's all on the one site. So, that leaves, as you've mentioned, it's a large building.
Absolutely. I mean, we haven't even mentioned casket display rooms. Here we've got a room with over 30 caskets in it, plus caskets out the back. It takes up a lot of space. So when we're thinking of funeral homes, we're looking at quite large buildings, large footprints, and that in itself is going to carry, quite a large cost for the owner, directors, rent, mortgages. So we have to factor that into our pricing.
Definitely.
You think of all our ceremonial hearses that we're not going to leave outside. They have to be housed as well.
Which brings me to our next point, which is the vehicles.
Absolutely.
We have, several vehicles. I know for us, we have 7 vehicles that we have, that we've got to find homes for. So, that doesn't just include the hearse. Some people may think that we only have hearses. We don't just have hearses. We have transfer cars, which is the car that turns up, when
To the place
at
of
the
death.
place of death. That's right. We obviously have the hearses. We have office cars as well. So, there's a lot of different cars, and they don't just run themselves. Fuel's getting more expensive. Registration, warrant of fitness, upkeep, wear and tear, all of that. They've got to be looking pristine all the time.
Absolutely. So the reason we mention this is because these three factors are really going to influence how a funeral home charges for their funeral services. So your staff, your premises, and the cars are really your three main factors. So when people are looking at funeral homes, they should look at those three factors
Definitely.
first as
We're
well.
hoping one day that we're going to take this to an electric future.
Oh, look, I've been having my eye on that Tesla hearse for quite a while now. Not yet, but there is a future with that in it, I'm sure. So,
Okay, so let's move off. Okay, so we've allocated, three main costs. That's not, where it ends for us, as you would be well aware, but they're three of our biggest costs to us as the funeral home. But when we're moving into invoicing the family, what do you think, or what is the biggest cost to the family on that invoice?
Right. So when we're looking at charging on to the family for those services, the way we charge as a funeral home is with one fee called the professional service fee.
Right.
And this is not unsimilar to a way a lawyer or solicitor will charge. They also use a professional service fee. And it's a unique way that makes up the core revenue that allows us to continually provide that high level of service. And so it really culminates everything that we do as funeral directors and as a funeral home.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, for us as funeral homes, as you said, in order for us to continue to provide that service to the families and for people to be able to keep coming to the funeral home, that main professional services fee is what, makes sure that we're able to carry on.
Absolutely. And, what it includes will vary between funeral home to funeral home.
That's right.
And it's really important that when you are sitting down with your funeral director and you're discussing that professional service fee, so you actually ask what that does include. And it can include, all kinds of things. The main core of the professional service fee is going to be, of course, that labour charge that we talked about, our staff fees. And we actually did a bit of a tally up earlier, and we worked out that most funeral services are actually going to take between 20 to 40 hours of labour costs.
Yeah, that's right. And that's not just only for the funeral director that you see. And when we're touching on that as well, you may only see that funeral director for 2 to 5 hours, let's say. A couple of hours at the funeral service and a couple of hours, when you first initially meet them and
Sure.
sit down and figure out all the arrangements. So what you see physically and what is actually going on in the background with the administrators, with the graphic designers, with the other embalmers, with other funeral directors, it all creates the funeral service, and it doesn't just happen with one person.
No, that's absolutely right. And when you actually compare it to other trades out there, we talked about if you got a lawyer for the same amount of time, they're going to charge double what we charge.
And they're not going to come out at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Certainly not going to come out, at least not my lawyer. And you look at a plumber, you're spending 40 hours, it's going to be almost triple what we're going to charge as funeral directors. So we are priced very, very fairly for the level of service that we're providing. We talk a little bit about how a professional service fee is calculated.
Yeah.
And how that actually flows on to the family in terms of a final fee. And there's two main methods that we kind of identified earlier. Do you want to touch on the first one?
Yeah, I think traditionally as funeral directors, we've sort of based it on three things. Whether they've received a basic service, whether they've received a middle service, so, middle of the road style, or whether they've gone for the full service, which requires more that 40 hours worth of staff labour. So they are that's the traditional method. However, times have changed, things are sort of changing, and we don't see that a set fee suits every family. You can't put one funeral into the same as somebody else's, and we're tailor making funerals now a lot more than what we did, in years gone by.
That's right. And we kind of look at it now, and there's so many extra services that we're providing than, say, Granddad was 40 years ago. So much more. And it's very hard just to lump families into 3 different categories or 3 different boxes: basic, middle, and high. And what we're actually doing now is we're tailoring that professional service fee specifically to the family and the services they receive. So they're not paying any extra or any less than the exact service that they received. And we believe that's the fairest way to on-charge those services to a family.
Okay, so people are at home, they've probably got their questions, they're getting their questions ready, and make sure you get your questions in, because you can ask us a question about any style of, to do with the funeral industry, embalming, funeral directing, costs and pricing. We're happy to look at anything. So get your questions in. But I think probably now that we've touched on this professional service fee and we've spent a bit of time on it, people will probably be wanting to know, what could a professional service fee cost somebody? I mean, obviously it's got a broad spectrum, and obviously every funeral home in the country would have a different professional service fee.
Sure, and what we're really saying is it's all going to depend on what that family have asked for, what kind of service that they want us to provide. But we can give a pretty reasonable spectrum, and most PS fees around New Zealand are going to come in between $2,500 to about $5,500. And anything wildly above that doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong. But it would be wise to question this further with a funeral director. So if you're up around the $6,000 mark, just ask, how did it get that high, and what does that include?
That's right. And as Terry said, it could be not out of the range for it to be over 6,000, depending on the level of service that they're providing you. However, it is always worth questioning, or not questioning, but just asking the question on whether what that includes and what they're getting for that.
That's absolutely right. And as we said before, each funeral home will include slightly different things in that professional service fee. So always a really good idea to ask when you're sitting down with that funeral director. Of course, we're talking about families who know what they want. They've got the money to pay for it. Some families want the lavish gold-plated casket. They want all the extras. And we are happy to provide that extra service for families who are willing to pay for that. But of course, not all families out there have just got $10,000 cash sitting in the bank ready to spend on a funeral.
Yeah, that's right.
And so a lot of our time is kind of spent saving costs for families. And we've got a little bit of a section on this that would be great to cover at where people could make savings should they want to cut costs.
Definitely. Budget-friendly funerals, are very common. As you said, not everybody does have $10,000 to put into a funeral. So we're going to give you a couple of ways that you could save money, but still get a meaningful farewell, because that's what we're here to achieve, right? We're here to make sure that everybody gets a meaningful farewell. So let's start with probably the first one that comes to the top of my head, and that would be newspaper notices.
Sure.
Newspaper notices traditionally have been the way to notify, family, friends, people near and far. That can be done through your local paper, or it can be done through a national paper. However, they can be very expensive. And what people probably don't understand is that you pay per centimetre column. So if you are, writing a big notice including all your family, brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, it could cost you anywhere between $250 and $500 for that notice.
Yeah, and that's a pretty common price range that we see, especially with Hawke's Bay Today being inherently one of the most expensive local papers to advertise in. Those costs are right up there in normality. And families should be aware that if they're inserting 2 or 3 notices in 2 or 3 different nights, it's not uncommon for those newspaper fees to get over $2,000. Just on notifying people.
Yeah,
and these are costs that we can directly start cutting down. Maybe let's just do one notice. We've even talked earlier about alternatives to death notices in the newspaper. Do you want to share a bit about that?
Definitely. I think as we're using digital media a lot more, we're using digital media tonight running this Facebook live stream. So we'll use Facebook as an example. Facebook is becoming the most popular way to connect with family and friends near and far. So we're using Facebook a lot more to publish notices, to show families, using our own Gateway Funeral Services Facebook page, or we can, help them write a notice for their own Facebook page.
Absolutely. And of course, It doesn't cost anything to use Facebook.
That's right.
It can spread across the country, around the world within a matter of minutes, hours. Everyone's notified of the funeral service.
That's right.
So a really key way just to shave off a few bucks right at the start before anything's happened. Another one that really comes to mind, another traditional kind of cost that's involved is flowers.
Yeah.
You know, so often we talk about arranging a $350 casket spray, sometimes even more than that. It adorns the casket, don't get me wrong, it looks beautiful, but it's on display for an hour or so and then it's taken away.
Sometimes to be cremated.
Sometimes we're cremating flowers or burying them, and just seems like quite an exuberant cost when there are alternatives to that. You know, you talked earlier about kind of Nana's garden.
Yeah, that's right. And I think flowers are traditionally started with the formal wreath, which was used many years ago on caskets. But now we've gone with more of a contemporary design, which is, you know, a casket spray, as you said, adorns the casket. But there's plenty of options. I mean, if you're working within a budget, then flowers, you know, Nana or grandpa or mum or dad, maybe they grow a lovely garden. They love their roses. It's such a personal touch to put flowers straight from their garden onto the casket.
So on the day of the funeral, maybe cut a few roses from Nana's garden and use those. You know, alternative to flowers, we've even had things like golf clubs on the casket, or a guy's model aeroplane, which he loved flying so much, sat on the casket.
Exactly.
So we don't necessarily have to have flowers,
Yeah.
and there are cost savings all over there. So something to think about too.
Speaking of high costs, I mean, we talked about the professional services fee, but probably the next most expensive fee that you would find on a funeral invoice would be your catering costs.
Oh, yes. So it's going to be one of your single highest charges on a funeral invoice. And that's because most caterers are going to be charging around $10 to $15 per head. Now, it depends in different areas and different caterers what that charge is. But this is your classic saucy rolls, your club sammies, your tea, coffee, juice, maybe
Classic funeral
maybe
food.
a raspberry slice if you're
lucky.
that way inclined. But, you know, when we're talking about catering for 200 to 300 people, you know, this charge is $3,500 to $4,000. So right off the bat, this is, you know,
It's a serious amount of money.
it is a serious amount of money. And so you really have to think as a family, you know, are we really here to feed everyone? It's not a sit-down meal. It's really just a token gesture to say, hey, thanks for coming. Have a cup of tea. Let's talk about Dad a little
So
bit.
there's a couple of different ways we can work this. I mean, if you didn't want to provide refreshments because that didn't not even reach into the budget, then you can just invite everyone to go down to the local pub and share in a beer. Or if you weren't going to go, then they can toast to your loved one. Alternatively, we tend to try and get people to stay around and mingle and share in fellowship with the funeral goers and just to show a token of their appreciation for them coming to the service. So, I mean, even a simple cup of tea and coffee, juice, water, and some biscuits.
That's right.
You know, it's simple. It does not cost a lot. And it could really, you know, that's just, at least you're sharing in some time with them and showing your appreciation for them turning up.
That's right. I've also had families say, hey, can you bring a plate instead of flowers to the funeral? And everyone's just had a bit of a potluck after the funeral, which is a really cool thing to do because everyone bought their Nana's favourite slice or lamingtons, which everyone knew she loved. So another meaningful way to, you know, add value there. One that I did want to bring up, which is cremation versus burial. And we have talked a little bit about this in previous episodes, but it is one that you can save costs on because the cremation versus burial is such a vast difference in value. And here in Havelock North, a burial plot can cost you over $4,500, which is right up there considering a cremation here in Hastings now is $660. So really something to think about. Hey, if Dad did want burial, you know, are the funds there to purchase a new plot?
Yeah, but, you know, even saying that, you can still meet Dad's wishes or Mum's wishes or whoever's wishes by still having their ashes interred to be buried. You know, they may have a family plot, or they want it to be buried next to their loved one, or maybe even in the same plot as their loved one. They can still have their ashes interred for a very small fee that doesn't even go close to the $4,000 mark.
Right, so we could do potentially a $600 cremation and maybe $100 to inter those ashes at your local cemetery.
That's right.
So another way just to save costs.
I think, you know, when you're doing cremations and burials, you know, it it has to meet the budget, definitely with those ones. But the other part is around the venue. I mean, we do a lot of services, in crematorium chapels and things like that. But if you were wanting to have a more, budget friendly, or you were going to have a big service, but you were on a budget, some venues are extremely expensive for something that you could do a lot cheaper somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we sit down with a family and we start planning how this funeral is going to look, one of the first questions, and it is hard to answer on date one, is how many people do you think are going to attend this funeral?
Unfortunately, it's not like a wedding where you send out invites.
No, it's not. You
No.
can't just say who is or isn't coming. And it can vary on a few different things. How old is this person? Have they lived well into their 90s? They may have had a lot of friends pass away. Or are they much younger and a part of many community groups? It's going to be a much larger funeral. And when we start determining those factors, we start working out what venues are going to be appropriate. There's no point us having a funeral service with 30 people in a 200-seat chapel. And of course, we're not going to invite 200 people to our 30-seat chapel here.
That's right.
So we have to start thinking about venues, and each venue has with it a set fee and cost. You talked about having services at the crematorium, which can be quite a cost-effective way to do that. Like you, we of course have our own chapel, Crestwood, which is $400 for that 200-seat chapel, which is a pretty reasonable fee.
Right.
If you're thinking about having services for 800 to 1,000 people, be prepared to get up into the thousands to hire a venue there.
Yeah, and it's definitely something to consider if you are looking at doing something of that sort of level.
Yeah, and we haven't even spoken really about setup costs. So you're having a funeral service in a hall, might be a great idea. But think about things like sound systems and microphones, TVs that we have to
Chairs.
bring in, chairs, which, hey, you might be getting that hall for $200 from the local scouts, but we're going to be bringing in $750 worth of gear just to be able to have that.
And your
funeral service.
hireage fees just balloon.
All factors that we take into consideration there. How we get to the funeral, again, is quite a cool one. It's the ceremonial hearse. Again, one of the most traditional things. Long gone to the days of the horse and cart, which is how it used to be.
Yeah.
Now we've got beautiful ceremonial hearses. We here have got Chevy Impalas, which are your classic hearse, right through to your Holden Bumps, modern day hearses. I know you've got a couple of nice cars.
Yeah,
your
that's
place.
right. We've got the Chevy Caprice hearse, which is very similar to the Impala, and the Ford LTD stretched wagon as well. So they're very nice, but again, they come at a cost. And some people, choose to personalize that service a lot more. Now, if dad or grandpa or whatever had an old Dodge truck, Dodge Ram or something along those lines, you may want to put him on the back of that. Alternatively, he may have been a truck driver. Some people like to put the deceased on the back of a truck. You talked about, fire engines.
Yeah, one of the most meaningful services I had was for an old fiery here at the Havelock North Fire Brigade. They actually put him on a fire pump truck, back of the fire truck, and it was the coolest thing. So people need to know that while we do provide these ceremonial hearses, and they are quite effective, they can provide their own hearse.
And that's right. And, that comes at no cost to them either
Yeah.
when they provide their own vehicle.
Now, one of the biggies that tends to come up quite a lot, more than anything else that we've talked about before, are caskets. This is that first kind of tangible purchase that the family get to make. And they come in, they see it, they can touch it, it's got price tags on it. This is where it really comes to light about how much money is being spent.
Yeah, the perception of coffins over the years, you always hear about it. Oh, the casket's going to cost us $3,000, or the casket's going to cost us a lot of money. That perception's wrong. You can choose a casket, and they start at a very, very fair range. And yes, they do go up into some high numbers, but that's if you're working with a lavish budget.
So what could people expect to pay for a casket? What's the kind of general range out there?
So you could start off with a casket that would be suitable only for cremation, made of MDF or, with no handles, for around $500 to $600. Then, if you really wanted to go to the other end of the spectrum, you could spend $5,000 on a solid mahogany or a solid Remu or something along those lines. But the in-between range, there's plenty of beautiful caskets that could suit anybody in between that $500-$600 and that $5,000. And I would say
Absolutely.
Most caskets that we would sell would be anywhere between the $1,000 and $2,000 mark.
Yeah, sure. It all depends on what people's tastes are, what's going to be suitable, what did the deceased like. You know, we've got plain pine right through to, as you said, the solid mahoganies, painted caskets, even custom wraps now. You can print Nana's Garden on the side of the casket.
That's right,
We'll
yeah.
have a bit of a sky and a rainbow. So these are all options that are out there.
So we're talking about personalising caskets. Let's talk about the fact of the DIY. We've had so many DIY, you know, there's been a lot of DIY talk around funerals over the last few years. Can I make my own casket and can we use it?
Absolutely, and that's an important point that you bring up, because people don't have to buy a casket from a funeral home. I mean, inherently it is very, very convenient. We have them all here in all different sizes, ready to go. But you can make or buy your own casket and provide it. You know, there are a couple of risks that are involved. You and I buy our caskets from a manufacturer. They've been stress and weight tested, so we know that they're going to perform well at the funeral service. Something to think about is, if you built your own, is it strong enough? You know, I've heard of stories of else, you know, where the bottom has fallen out during the funeral. And so
it's not a good look.
it's not a good look. No one's looking good when that happens.
No.
And so that's something to think about. You know, often people make their own casket or they buy it, and it gets to us, we're just about to put the deceased in and it's the wrong size. It's too small. You know, they forgot to measure, or they just bought the wrong size, and they end up buying a casket from us anyway.
And that does happen more often than people would think. And,
Yes,
and
it
so
does.
it is an unfortunate thing, because, you know, it's that personalisation. We're all about the personalisation, the tailor making of a funeral service. And when it gets to that point, it is sad for that person, because they went to the effort to buy it and it didn't happen for them. So I guess, you know, the implications are there, but, you know, when you are dealing with a casket, you may be dealing with a coffin club. You know, you've got them here in the Hawke's Bay. I've got them up in the Eastern Bay. They do have coffins, but one thing to remember is you will need to store that casket somehow. And so, you know, us at Gateway Funeral Services and you here at Terry Longley and Son, we, you know, are happy to store caskets that have been pre-made or pre-purchased by the family, you know, on the basis that they're going to use our services when that time comes.
Yeah, and anyone that's involved in the DIY Coffin Club, I think it's a great thing for the oldies to get together, knock up a casket, talk about their own wishes and their own views on death. And when you're finished with that casket, do bring that into us. We're happy to store it, as you said, Brad, with the intention that you do want to have that funeral service with us.
So what about the part when we've talked about the cost, you know, we've covered all the bases, you know, majority of the bases on, you know, where to save costs, what's going to be your most expensive costs, the caskets, etc. Where shouldn't you save on cost? Where should you not skimp when it comes to funerals?
That is a great question. I just want to remind everyone before we go into that if you're at home watching on the stream, if you've got any questions, comment them below in the comment section, and Brad and I are actually going to address those and answer those here tonight. And it'd be good to hear what you want to know and see what we can come
Yeah, that's
up
right.
with.
There's been plenty of questions asked over the years, as you would know. As a funeral director, we get asked all sorts of questions. So make sure you get those questions in.
Absolutely. So where shouldn't you cut costs? You know, and this is something that comes up where people may be short of cash and they say, hey, look, we don't want embalming because we don't have enough money. And we really have to kind of talk with them about this. And embalming is of course, as we talked about in our last episode, our best practice. Yeah. It's all about restoring that dignity and respect back to the deceased, giving that family that beautiful memory picture and allowing them to grieve properly. And if we're trying to cut costs, we don't recommend that embalming is the first place to start. Maybe we reduce the catering from 300 down to 100 and let's keep embalming, because we want Nana to look her best.
Yeah, that's right. Respect and dignity is such a big part of what we do. And I feel that the embalming aspect is so important to restoring that for that deceased. One thing to consider as well is that if you decide that you don't want embalming, there's a very real chance that if the deceased is staying with us at the funeral home and they're going to be in our climate control facility, there's a very real chance that you will pay for your deceased to be stored there. And that could end up, depending on how long the deceased is with us, could end up costing you more than what it would have been if the deceased had been embalmed in the first place.
That's right. So choosing not to embalm, as we again talked about in episode 2, does have alternatives we can present, but those alternatives do cost money as well. So it's just about being transparent with the families, making sure they're informed that their choices do have those costs associated to it.
Now, we're talking about costs again, so let's talk about the fact of finance. Let's talk about the finance. When is the best time to have a conversation with the family about finance? Because it's a very real part of what we're doing.
Yeah, look, most funeral homes are going to have their own finance policies in place, and they're most likely going to address this with you when they start planning the funeral service. And it's really, really important to let the funeral director know that if funds are tight or you're working to a budget, that you bring this up
Very early on.
Very early on. There's no point planning this lavish funeral service, getting to the end and realising that you can't afford it.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, with that in mind, deposits are becoming, much more common now. Funeral homes will ask you to pay a portion of the funeral up front, and that is purely there to cover all those costs that you will incur, like the newspaper notices and the catering and all these things. That just covers those costs initially so that we can carry on doing the work for you.
That's absolutely right. From a cash point, we're paying thousands of dollars for each funeral service to other suppliers, crematoriums and things like that. So we just need a little bit up front to cover that. We've implemented that just over a year ago. We actually asked for a 25% deposit up front, and all families pay that. And it's become pretty accepted now that that's a thing to do. So families should be aware that, hey, they may need to pay a deposit, and just to have some funds readily accessible, be it on a credit card or EFTPOS or a bank account transfer.
But when we're talking about, paying for a funeral, is some financial assistance out there for people. And that comes through the Working Income New Zealand funeral grant. Now, you're able to apply for this sometimes with your funeral director, or personally you can go down to Working Income and apply for this. And this is worth almost $2,100. And that's not going to pay for the funeral. Don't get me wrong. It's not going to pay for the funeral, but it will definitely help with those costs that you will incur.
Absolutely. And it's important to note for that WINS grant that it is asset and means tested. So if the deceased has got multiple properties, they've got cash in the bank, they've got assets, they're going to take that into account, and they may not be as eligible to receive those funds.
And the other thing which is worth mentioning as well is that you don't have to be on a benefit or on a superannuation in order to be eligible for this.
No, that's right. It's available to all New Zealand citizens for that. So well worth applying for. It doesn't cost anything to apply. So we do encourage most families to see if that is available to them.
But before you get to that needing of financial assistance, and we're talking about the finance, how nice would it be if you were all covered? You'd pre-planned, or you'd prepaid, or you had an insurance policy covering all of this, and the less stress, the better.
Obviously, when you put it that way, Brad, it is just a peace of mind. You're kind of leaving your legacy to your children, your kids. They don't have to cover a single cost because you've organised it in advance. And there's two kind of main ways that we can go about addressing this. The first one, which we talk about, is that funeral insurance. And I don't know if you've watched the 6 o'clock news lately and seen those Cigna ads, which just continue to come up, telling you that you can get $30,000 cover for your funeral, which seems a little bit high to me.
Well, I remember the first time we saw that. We were actually together when we were studying. If you watch podcast number 1, you would have seen that me and Terry studied, or Terry and I, should I say, studied together in 2017. And we were sitting there one night after a day's study, watching the TV, and we saw it come up on the screen. There's Keith Quinn, $30,000 for a funeral. What an exorbitant amount of money that is not necessary at all.
Certainly not. And I do recall sitting with a man a year or so ago, and he came to me and said, look, I'm thinking about getting funeral insurance. It's going to cost me this much. And we actually worked out what his funeral service was going to cost, and worked out that if he was to prepay the funeral home directly, he'd actually have it paid off in 5 years. And I said, do you think you're going to pass away in the next 5 years? He said, mate, I've got another 10 in me at least. So he actually opted to prepay the funeral home, which is our second kind of option here.
Right, so let's hear about the prepaying side of things.
Yeah, so that's how that would work is that you would meet with a funeral director, tell them your wishes, and they're most likely going to come up with an estimation of costs based on what that funeral service is likely to cost. And if it's in the vicinity of, say, $8,000, then we'll probably recommend that maybe you pay $8,500 or $9,000 just to have a little bit extra in the kitty there, just in case anything changes.
Right.
And so at that point, you can then decide to prepay the funeral home. Now, even when you prepay a funeral home, there's kind of two different options here. A funeral home will either have their independent trust, so they accept your funds, it goes into a secure trust with trustees, and it cannot be accessed until you pass away.
So that money is, just to clarify for people, is not going into the funeral home's bank account, operating account. That is purely going into a trust account.
Goes into a trust account. It's going to gain interest. All that interest belongs to the family, and with an independent funeral trust, they can withdraw that at any time if they wish. The other option, of course, is the Funeral Directors Association of New Zealand have a funeral trust, I understand.
Yeah, so that's the one that we use. We don't have our own independent trust. The Funeral Directors Association in New Zealand has a prepaid funeral trust plan, and basically it works in the exact same way as the independent trust. You pay the money in there. You can pay it sort of monthly, weekly, fortnightly, however it may be, and you only pay what the funeral is worth. And that is the crux of it. That is, we obviously are out to promote our trusts and the way that they can benefit the families, because we believe they can benefit families more than paying and paying and paying. It's like if we took out a funeral insurance plan with Cigna now, and we didn't pass away for another 50 years.
Pretty sure I don't need funeral cover, Bradley,
but if we did, 50 years' time, we would have paid in excess of what, the funeral cover is worth. Whereas with the trust plans, you literally just pay what the funeral's worth and you stop.
That's absolutely right. And it's also important to note that if the family or children at the time of arranging that funeral change their minds and they want something different, and there's a bit of funds left over, they're actually going to get those funds back in the form of a cheque at the end of the funeral. And those funds are actually accessible immediately to the funeral home. So like insurances, you don't have to wait for claims to go through and death certificates to arrive and things like that. So just something to think about when you're thinking about prepaying or insurance.
Right. So we've got to the point where we're going to take some questions. So if you've got questions at home and you really want to know a certain aspect about the funeral industry, anything to do with the funeral industry, embalming, cost, pricing, anything, get at us and ask us what you'd like to know.
Yeah, so we've got a question in here already from Jen, and Jen asks, what costs are associated if the person has died in another part of the country and you need to get them home for a funeral?
That's a great question.
Something that happens quite often around New Zealand too.
Yeah, it definitely does. And, when we're dealing with deceased from different areas, the most important part is to engage that funeral director local to them and start getting that process sorted. If we have to fly the deceased, from, say, down south somewhere up to Auckland or up to Tauranga or Whakatane or somewhere, or even to the Hawke's Bay, there is a little bit of a process involved with flying the deceased, around the country. So that does incur some cost, and it will add, on top of what the funeral bill, would be typically at home. So essentially, you're paying two funeral directors to do two jobs.
Yeah, it all depends on a time factor, really. If the person is a 5-hour drive away, it might actually be beneficial to engage a funeral home in the city of death, get them to do the initial transfer and embalming, and then the receiving funeral home might get on the road the very next day, head up there and transfer that deceased back to the funeral home. Travelling by road is always the most cost-effective way to transfer a body around New Zealand. I mean, if you're going from the far south to the far north, then by all means, let's put it on Air New Zealand jet flight, which will definitely be more cost-effective. But it does happen more often than you think.
Yeah, and it is common.
We've always got staff and vehicles ready to get on the road and transfer people back to their home city.
All right, we've got a question here from Amy Brooks, and she says, can I get a picture of a Mai Tai on my casket?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit before about custom wraps on their casket, and so people printing all sorts of different things. Of course, Amy, you can get a Mai Tai printed on your casket. That's a Hawaiian cocktail, if you didn't know that, Bradley.
Oh.
One of my favourites, actually.
Is it?
Yes,
all
indeed.
Right.
A question here from Louise Tillett, and she asks, But you don't have to use the services of a funeral director, do you? So you can cut costs, transportation, having the body at home, doing all that stuff with the whānau. And so what we're getting at is kind of more of a DIY process, giving the family control back to do more of those tasks themselves. And we're totally open to working with the family to do that. We like to sit down with them first and give them some advice. There are a few hooks and traps which can catch them up.
Yeah, there has been some issues in the past with DIY or what we call family-led funerals. And there was a story not so long ago where the guy was driving his mother around town for 3 days trying to find someone to certify a cremation. So
it was here in the Hawke's Bay too. I remember reading it on the paper, and
Yeah.
we felt so sorry for the guy, but he just refused to come and see a funeral director, and we would have just given him that advice on day one.
That's right. And all it takes is just a conversation with the funeral director. And if you decide you want to go and do that yourself, by all means, that's not a problem. But we just need to make sure that your loved one gets a dignified farewell.
That's right. We're here to help. We're here to advise on these things and give you some options.
All right, we've got a question here from Dylan Carpenter. Is it true you charge big money for coffins and handles, expensive linings, and then remove them and reuse them and recharge?
Yeah, so we touched on caskets just earlier on, and we talked about this big money thing, and we actually said that we've got caskets from as little as $500, so not a big expense in the scheme of a funeral service. Of course, we do have expensive caskets right up to $5,000, which do have those nice linings. Now, I don't know about anywhere else in the country, but if someone is for burial or cremation, the entire casket gets buried or cremated.
That's right.
Including the handles. So.
Yeah, and the only time that the handles would ever be removed for a cremation is if they were metal. Now, you may not know, Dylan, but most handles on caskets are all made of plastic, just so that they are combustible in the cremation. Unfortunately, metal does not combust, so that's the only time we would ever take handles off. As if they're metal, and they're disposed of.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. And we certainly don't reuse a casket that we've sold to a family or that's had a deceased in it. I know there are some funeral homes out there that use a rental liner system, but in that case, the deceased goes into a cremation liner, which sits inside the rental casket, and that comes out.
And the families are well aware of that.
They are certainly informed when they make that choice if they're getting a rental casket or not. Another one here from Nikki Rose. Can ACC help with the costs if the death is accidental?
Yeah, that's a great question. We touched on financial assistance earlier. ACC, basically the short of it, ACC pays out on all accidental deaths. So that includes motor vehicle accidents, homicides, and things along those
Slips
lines.
or falls.
That's
anything
right.
that was deemed generally by the coroner to be an accident eligible for
That's
ACC.
right. So they're eligible for around $6,200.
That's right.
And that is paid upon the receiving of a death certificate
Now-
and the relevant forms.
That's right. Now, that is not just applicable to New Zealand residents.
That's right.
That's anyone who dies in New Zealand, be it a tourist or anyone that's travelling here, and they die suddenly for whatever reason, are eligible for that.
All right, we've got another one here from Nikki Rose. She's got a couple of questions for us.
Great.
She says, well, we talked about the repatriation. When we say repatriation, that includes moving a deceased around the country domestically or internationally. So Nikki has asked, where does a body travel in an aircraft? Do they just travel in the cargo hold or on... do they just travel in the cargo hold on normal passenger planes?
Yeah, good question. And I mean, I used to be a commercial pilot back in the day, so I know a little bit about how they go about cargo holds and things like that. Now, in New Zealand, flying domestically, the caskets will fly in cargo, and the reason that they don't fly in any smaller domestic aircraft is because they don't like to stack luggage or bags on top of that casket if they're flying in cargo. So there's actually not enough room in those smaller domestic flights. So it's only the jet fleet that will actually let you transport caskets inter-island and around New Zealand. Of course, when you're getting up to the big international flights, much more room in the cargo holds, and you can find that you can get a casket in there with luggage without stacking on top. So yes, they are in the cargo hold. They're certainly not in the passenger compartment. They're not flying business class at all. They will be in the casket in the cargo hold.
Okay, so we got one here from Rawania Hape, and she says, this is a question that will be answered by both of us. So, do your service provide cultural intervention to whānau, i.e. karakia, and also viewing the loved one if waiting to be transported for an autopsy?
So this is a bit of a two-parter. Would you like to do the first
I'll
part?
do the first part and Terry will do the second part. So, does our service provide cultural intervention for whānau, i.e. karakia? The answer for that is yes. At Gateway Funeral Services, we have cultural staff, so Māori staff, who are well versed in te reo Māori and are very, very culturally sensitive, and they are well versed in karakia. So, should your whānau wish to or not have someone who can perform a karakia, whether that's before the deceased goes through for embalming, or once the deceased is out of the embalming process and getting ready for that journey back to the marae.
Right. So your staff are well trained in the tikana, as we say.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So they have a long history with karakia, couple of them specifically, and so the answer to that question is yes.
Excellent.
The
Now,
second part to that question, Terry.
is there a viewing allowed when a loved one is waiting to be transported for autopsy? Now, here in Hawke's Bay, the autopsies aren't actually conducted here. They're conducted in Palmerston North. So when someone dies suddenly or suspiciously, they enter what we call the coronial system. So the coroner then takes charge of that person and they go into a holding facility, which here is at the Hastings Hospital, where they're kept until an autopsy is scheduled. Now, generally that's not a place where people can just come at any time to see their deceased, but in fact they can book a viewing. They get in touch with the coroner's office, they approve it, we meet the family there, and we make sure the deceased is looking dignified and respectable, and they can spend up to 2 hours at a time with their deceased before autopsy.
But what people, would need to understand is that, it can be confronting because you're not allowed to do any embalming procedures. The deceased is still under coroner's jurisdiction, and so that means that there are specific rules around what you can and can't do.
That's right. So generally they're still in the same state of which they passed away. So sometimes eyes and mouth, which we think naturally close when someone dies, it could be still open. It's not the most pleasant funeral home.
No,
we always
it's not.
recommend that you wait for them to get back to a funeral home where an embalmer can make them look as
But
nice
at the
as
same
possible.
time, we understand the cultural sensitivity.
That's right.
And with Māori, we try our best to work with the coroner and work with the whānau about finding a happy medium.
Definitely, it's a very common thing. We do that quite often, actually. Marie asks, without embalming, how long does a body last? And I think by last she means before that decomposition really sets in.
It's really it's a great question, Marie, because there is no set time frame on how long a body does last. It all depends on a couple of aspects. The first one, and this is the most important one, would be the cause of death, how that person passed away. Have they been, the next part would be, have they been in climate control facility or whether they're just not in a climate control facility at all. So there's so many different aspects to that. But let's say, let's use an example. Let's say, Marie, we wanted to take a deceased home for a couple of days or left at the funeral home, not in a climate control facility. You may be able to get away in summer with 1 to 2 days maximum.
Yeah.
After that, the dignity of the deceased is no longer
Starts to
there.
decline.
That starts to decline, and things start to go, on that natural progression through the decomposition phase. So
Sure.
it's not recommended.
And it largely depends on that cause of death as well.
Definitely.
So, as we say, strongly recommend embalming, but you may be able to get, a few days before that person starts to look not so nice.
Okay, we got one here from Tim. Tim, if you don't want to be embalmed, what are the options? And what are the options for non-plastic handles or natural caskets?
Yeah, your first option, Tim, is going to be watch podcast episode 2, where we do talk about that.
We spent about an hour on that, Tim.
But it's certainly alternatives. We talk about the climate control facility, that refrigeration unit. We touched on dry ice quite a lot, which is the use of cold pellets to reduce the core temperature down to about -70, which has proven to be quite effective. The second part of that, what are the options for non-plastic handles or natural caskets? So, we do have natural pine caskets, which have actually rope handles, which are again a very natural twine product.
Very authentic.
Very authentic. They can be cremated. We of course also have eco caskets. So these are caskets which haven't got the glues, the resins, or any nasties in it. So your natural untreated
Staples
pine.
and nails and things like that.
That's right. And so if someone wanted a natural burial, for example, we would show them the pine range, which has all those just natural timbers, untreated, and which would be suitable for that. They're actually the cleanest cremating caskets. I don't know if you knew that.
There you go.
But pine is your best cremating casket in terms of emission. So
There you go.
something to think about.
Well, that leads us to the next question, and Nikki's back again. What sort of cost are you looking at for a natural burial plot in a non-traditional cemetery setting in comparison to a traditional burial plot in a lawn cemetery? Is there any significant difference? So I don't know about the Hawke's Bay. I'll speak specifically about the Eastern Bay first, and then we'll work from there. Natural burial is not an option in the Eastern Bay of Plenty. So you may find this difficult to imagine, but there is no natural burial cemetery in the Eastern Bay of Plenty. The closest natural burial cemetery where you can have a proper natural burial in a non-traditional burial plot like a lawn cemetery is in Hamilton. So that's 2.5 hours drive away. So we tend to not do many natural burials. We do get people with wishes who want to go down that natural line, and we can try and meet those needs as best we can along the lines of those pine caskets and the calico side sets and the non-embalming and
Sure.
or natural embalming, which is an option as well. So look, there are plenty of options, but unfortunately in the Eastern Bay of Plenty, there aren't any options for that.
Yeah, and look, and in the Hawke's Bay, we actually have a natural burial site. It actually opened a few years ago. It's yet to be used. That is a traditional cemetery, though. I think Nikki is asking about non-traditional cemeteries, maybe urupas or privately owned cemeteries.
Right.
Hard to say exactly what the cost is for some of those cemeteries.
Yeah.
As we mentioned, if you do want a plot in a local cemetery, you're looking at between $3,000 and $5,000 for that plot.
Yep.
Hard to say what a private or alternative urupa might cost.
Do you provide, this is a question from Misa, do you provide services to various ethnicities and religions?
Yeah, look, we're such a complex society now. It's so diverse. We've got all kinds of ethnicities and different religions out there now, and we're open to all of those. We're not going to discriminate. Quite often we're doing Māori families through to Muslims, through to our Jewish community. All have slightly different requirements.
That's right.
A well-trained funeral director and qualified funeral director will know exactly how to deal with those different kind
and
of
I tell you from
attributes.
from a personal perspective, you would be with me on this, and it's so refreshing to learn someone else's culture, learn what their burial rites are and how they operate their funeral service. So it can be a learning journey for us as well. I mean, we're qualified funeral directors, but there's always something that's new for us. And so it's really cool to provide services and to work with families who have specific religious or ethnic backgrounds that they really want to honour when the time comes.
Absolutely, and it's a really unique thing to do, and we're always open to doing that. Let's take 2 more questions, Bradley, before we wrap up the podcast. My last one here is from Andy, and he asks, what if we just want embalming done before going to the marae?
Yeah, that's a great question, Andy. That is perfectly possible. It happens regularly. You would deal with it regularly. I deal with it regularly. We basically the professional service, as we said earlier, is tailor-made to that family. So we definitely provide just embalming services. Typically that would centre around a transfer back to the funeral home, the embalming, give the family the opportunity to dress their loved one, have a karakia in the chapel, or by the casket, and then transferred back out to the marae. So that happens quite regularly, Andy.
Yeah, right. So we're just there to support the whānau through those early stages before going back to the marae, where they get to take full control over the tangi. We don't actually need to be a part of that if they don't need
And
our
that's
help.
right. And a lot of the time they're burying in their own private urupa, which we mentioned earlier, which has nothing to do with the councils or anything like that. It's all self-managed through the marae and through the hapu. So that is something that, we tend to not have a lot to do with, but we can definitely provide embalming services
The assistance and the advice is always there.
Definitely.
Should we take one more question? Should we?
All right, sounds good. Is it cheaper to cremate as soon as possible and then hold a memorial service? Now, before you comment on this is a widely known topic around funeral directors in our industry and around, the unattended cremation side of things. So let's talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, what a good last question to finish on. Should we cremate as soon as possible and then hold that memorial service down the track? Is that going to be cheaper? Well, in actual fact, when you look at it, you're going to save a couple of bucks on maybe the embalming, and maybe you're not going to need a hearse when it comes to the memorial service. So you're going to save a couple of $100, but what any good funeral director is going to tell you is that the emotional cost of cremating someone as soon as possible is going to be far greater than a few dollars saved from embalming and a hearse, because you're still going to have the venue and the catering, all those costs, but you're just skimping on those initial charges.
And it doesn't provide, the value that we emphasize about the value of a funeral and getting that grief journey for the family started in the best possible way.
That's right.
Us as funeral directors, we pride ourselves on doing the best service we can for that family, and we get one go at it, and we try and do the best thing we can. And if the choice is to have an unattended cremation, then, personally, and we're of the same opinion, it's not a great start to that journey.
No, that's right. And we put big emphasis on the viewing and visitation of the deceased. So once they're embalmed, they're looking nice, they're dressed, they're looking like Nana, that we invite family, grandchildren, come place a note in the casket, come spend some time and just allow that grieving process to happen
And it goes
naturally.
back to that dignity and respect.
That's right. So when we talk about cremating someone as soon as possible, we're actually depriving people the right to grieve properly. Yeah, you can still have that memorial service, but why not just have the casket there and people can feel like it's done properly.
That's right. And we could talk all day about the casket and the significance of the casket at the front of the funeral rather than an ashes box and a photo, but we don't genuinely have enough time for that.
No, that's excellent. Hey, Bradley, thank you again for coming down to the Hawke's Bay. It's been a great time. Always love hosting you here at the Terry Longley and Son Funeral Home. This isn't it for the podcast. We've got much more coming up this year, so we've got some big stuff in the pipeline over the next few months. We're going to continue the podcast, so look out for future episodes.
That's right, yeah. We just want to thank all our viewers, thank everyone for your questions. We pride ourselves on being able to answer those questions ad lib, and it's really nice to see some good quality questions and things that mean something to people. So thank you so much for your questions. Thank you, Terry Longley, for the invite to come back down to the Hawke's Bay. I want to thank Dan Brown and Andy from Indelible for setting up this wonderful podcast studio for us again, right here at Terry Longley and Son Funeral Services in Havelock North.
Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone watching at home, and we will see you soon.
See you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See ya.